Here's to anyone who's ever looked up. The airheads. And the space cases.
Live long and prosper.
The flight fanatics. The armchair astronauts. And the casually curious. Here's to those who know the thrust in newtons of a Pratt & Whitney J75 turbojet engine. And those who silently ask, what's keeping this thing in the air? Here's to those who can list the name, mission history, and favorite breakfast of every Mercury astronaut. And those who've ever searched for, how does a toilet work in space? Here's to the people who know a P-38 Lightning from a P-51 Mustang. And the people who thought those were the names of cars. Those captivated by the miracle of flight. And those who are just happy to make their flight. So whatever captures your curiosity.
We choose to go to the moon.
Or propels you to new heights. When it comes to the sky, there's space for all of us.
Good evening and welcome to the Stephen F. Udvar-Hazy Center. I'm Chris Brown, the John and Adrian Mars Director of the National Air and Space Museum, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's program. As a marquee lecturer of the museum's National Air and Space Society, Vice Admiral Donald D. Engen Flight Jacket Night is one of our biggest nights of the year for museum members, and I am pleased to see so many of you in the audience tonight and tuning in online. This annual event is named in honor of Don Engen, a decorated Navy pilot and FAA administrator who also served as the director of this museum. With this annual lecture, we strive to give members access to icons of aviation and space history as thanks for your enduring support. Flight Jacket Night is just one of the many ways we show our appreciation for the members of the National Air and Space Society. I hope you all are enjoying Air and Space Quarterly, our magazine published exclusively for Society members. I also want to recognize members of the other Smithsonian museums, as well as the National Zoo, who are in attendance, especially those supporters of the forthcoming Smithsonian American Women's History Museum. We are pleased to be able to include you this evening and look forward to more pan-institutional program opportunities. This is an incredibly eventful time here at the National Air and Space Museum, and your contributions are more important than ever. As we continue to welcome visitors into the first 8 of our reimagined galleries in our museum in D.C., which I hope you've had the chance to explore, we are also hard at work on even more galleries. With your support, our team has done an excellent job reimagining classic exhibits and telling previously untold stories in brand new galleries. Next year, we will open up our next set of galleries, including the Boeing Milestones of Flight Hall and our entrance onto the National Mall, Baron Hilton Pioneers of Flight, the new home of Charles Lindbergh's Spirit of St. Louis, and the renovated Lockheed Martin IMAX Theater. But that's just the beginning. We have a lot in store for you over the next few years, and as always, greatly appreciate your support. To balance a pleasant experience and immense interest in visiting, to balance a pleasant experience with immense interest in visiting, we continue to require free timed entry passes to the museum in D.C. But don't forget that we have set aside a select number of passes each day for you, Society members, as a thank you for your support. And with that, let's get to tonight's program. In just a moment, we're going to hear firsthand from the Air Force's first female fighter pilot. Major General Jeannie Leavitt entered the U.S. Air Force in 1982, earning her commission as a distinguished graduate of the Air Force ROTC program. She wanted to fly the F-15E Strike Eagle, but was initially denied her request due to DoD policy at that time. That policy changed in April 1993, and she became the Air Force's first female fighter pilot. She went on to become the first woman to attend the U.S. Air Force Weapons School, returning later as an instructor in 2001. General Leavitt took command of the 4th Fighter Wing in 2012, becoming the first woman to lead an Air Force combat fighter wing. She is a command pilot with more than 3,000 hours, including more than 300 hours in combat, or as we say, going in harm's way. She is the real deal. I'm certainly looking forward to hearing the stories she tells from her distinguished career. Joining General Leavitt in conversation is the museum's curator of U.S. Air Force, Navy, and Marine Corps post-World War II aviation, Dr. Michael Hankins. But before turning it over to Mike, I'd like to first share a brief introductory video about General Leavitt.
Lieutenant, I'm sure you're a Sierra Hotel pilot and looking forward to the F-15.
Yes, sir.
Is there anything you cannot do in comparison with your male counterparts? Do you have the stamina to compete one-on-one, do you think?
Yes, sir. I go through the same training that my male counterparts go through, and I've had no problems to this point, and I'm looking forward to the challenge of flying the F-15E.
Lieutenant, what is it?
When I started pilot training in 1992, the Air Force, indeed the world, was different. And trust me, so were the popular hairstyles.
I definitely wanted to fly fighters, so when it became...
I didn't set out to break barriers, but I've had a lot of opportunities in my career to do just that. From being the Air Force's first female fighter pilot to the first woman to command a combat fighter wing,
As members of the 57th Wing, we all have the chance to be part of something bigger than ourselves. I challenge you to take advantage of this opportunity.
and though I didn't used to like the term trailblazer, if it means that those who follow the same path meet less resistance, then I guess I'm okay with that title. The Air Force is different now, and so is my hair. But throughout the years, one thing has stayed the same: my philosophy.
Race, religion, none of that matters. What matters is how you perform.
And that's how I got here. It's the message we pass on to new airmen. It's the spirit of our great Air Force, and I couldn't be more proud to be a part of it.
All right. That was fantastic. Well, my name is Mike Hankins. I'm one of the curators here. I want to say thank you all for being here. It's great to see the room as full as it is. I really appreciate y'all coming out. And I know a lot of folks are watching online. Excuse me. Thank you so much for tuning in and spending the evening with us. And thank you, General, for being here.
Very happy to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, this is fantastic. So we've seen just now, you've had a very wide-ranging career. Let's dive right into this and go all the way back to the beginning. Can you tell us about what made you want to fly in the first place and join the Air Force specifically?
So the path was not straight. It's interesting because I know so many people who knew from the time they were a little child that they wanted to fly. And I didn't know because I didn't know any pilots. I didn't realize that that was an opportunity, that that was something I could do. In fact, I always wanted to fly in an airplane, even a commercial airplane. And we never did. My mom was scared of flying, so we took every other possible mode of transportation, never flew. And it wasn't until I'd graduated from high school and wanted to go visit my uncle in the next few states over that she put me on a plane by myself to go visit my uncle. And so that was my first time even in the air at age 18. And so I always tell people, like, you're way ahead of me if you've even flown on a commercial airplane, because I hadn't done that at age 18. So initially, I was just fascinated with flying. You know, how does this fly? How does this work? I loved engineering. And so I was studying aerospace engineering at the University of Texas. And they had a program where you could work a semester, go to school a semester, called the co-op program. And I was co-oping at NASA Johnson Space Center when I crossed paths with a second lieutenant in the Air Force waiting for pilot training. And that was when I really learned that that was something I could do. And I asked him about 1 million questions before I went back to my next semester at the University of Texas, found the ROTC office on a map, walked right in, and I said, I want to be a pilot. Wow. Never mind the fact that I had never been behind the controls of an airplane. I did not let that dissuade me. But when they found out I was an aerospace engineering major with a very good GPA, they said, all right, let's give this a shot. And that's how it all started.
That's fantastic. So you don't let anything stand in your way right from the beginning, which really leads into the next thing I wanted to ask you about, which was, as was mentioned a minute ago, when you first started out, there was a restriction against women in combat roles early on. So can you tell us a little bit about what that policy was, and when you were first coming into the Air Force, what options were actually open to you or not?
Sure. So it was initially against the law. So the law prevented any women from any form of combat. That all changed in 1991. And in August of 1991, Congress voted to allow a very small segment. And so combat aviation was opened up to women. All of the services were very opposed to the idea of women in any combat roles. And so when the Congress changed the law, the Department of Defense decided they needed time to study how they would implement this change. And so while they were doing studies, they decided they would have a policy of no women in combat. That was when I started pilot training. So when I started pilot training in 1992, it was interesting because the law had changed, but the policy hadn't. And how we do assignments out of pilot training has varied many times over the years. But when I graduated, the way you got your assignment after pilot training was based on merit order. And so you'd be rank ordered first to last, and then you would choose your assignment based on that merit order. Well, when the rankings came out, I got called into my commander's office, and he said, you finished first, but you cannot pick a fighter, a bomber, or a special ops airplane because they're all combat coded. And he said, if you're going to pick an airplane you can't have, then please have the professional courtesy to let us know. And I just said, yes, sir, and walked out because I didn't know what to do. This was a very unexpected situation I found myself in. And it was at this point where I received quite a bit of unsolicited advice from every instructor pilot I ever flew with. And universally, they all said, do not ask for a fighter. I had been very fortunate as an Air Force ROTC cadet and had 5 backseat rides in an F-16. So I kind of knew what it was like, and I really, really wanted to fly fighters. And there was an F-15E Strike Eagle in that drop. And they told me, they said, you'll ruin your career. You will go nowhere in this Air Force because you will be labeled a troublemaker and you're asking for an airplane you know you can't have. That's a little daunting. I was a second lieutenant, and after pilot training, I was going to owe 10 years. So I really didn't want to ruin those 10 years. But I also knew at some point, policy had to change. Might be weeks, months, years, but at some point, DOD would change policy and women would be allowed to fly fighters. And I didn't want to live with the regret of having never asked. Mm-hmm. And so I explained that to my leadership. They were not happy, but they understood. And when assignment time came, I stood up, I asked for the F-15E, I was told no. They quoted the DOD policy, told me to make another selection, so I did. And yes, I was disappointed, but I had no regrets. And I went to my next assignment, fired up to be best KC-10 pilot this Air Force had ever seen.
I have so many follow-up questions from that, but let's start with why do you think the policy did change all of a sudden in '93? What kind of pushed for that?
So there had been a number of organizations that recognized the fact that Congress had changed the law for a reason. You know, they believed that ruling out 50% of the population from all of these different roles might not be the best approach. You know, and so the idea was that something like combat aviation, why not open that up? And so there were different organizations like DACOWITS is the Defense Advisory Committee on Women in the Service, and other organizations were really pushing DOD to figure out how to implement this change that Congress had already changed. And so I think it was a number of things happening behind the scenes that really pushed DOD to make the change to allow women in combat aviation.
Yeah. So getting into the second question to follow up is you really talked about how much you wanted fighters. And so I want to dig into why that is, maybe more than just the obvious, they're cool. But we've been saying F-15E, and the E is important. And I think certainly myself and maybe a lot of us in this room kind of assume, we think the F-15 is an air-to-air platform, but the E Strike Eagle is a little bit different. Can you tell us about what is the E model of the Eagle? What makes it special? And why did you want that one?
Sure. So the F-15E is a much newer airplane than the F-15. The production didn't start until late 80s. And it's a two-seat airplane, unlike the F-15C. So we have a backseat position, a weapon systems officer. You can see the two seats there. It's also dual role, so both air-to-air and air-to-ground. And so it carries almost everything in the Air Force inventory and just an incredibly capable platform. And so it was the latest, greatest fighter, and I absolutely wanted to fly that coming out of pilot training.
Yeah. So what is the training like for getting into that? Once you're selected into it, I'm assuming you can't just walk in and start flying fighters. You have to prep for it. Can you walk us through the training process?
Sure. So, for one thing, just flying in general, it's very good to be very strong in many aspects. And so, physically, mentally, able to handle the stress of the flying environment. So from pilot training, you go to something called IFF, which is Introduction to Fighter Fundamentals. And so they have an AT-38 where you fly it much more aggressively, and you fly the basics of air-to-air and air-to-ground in a trainer where you can learn the basics. And from there, you then go to your appropriate platform. And so in my case, the Strike Eagle training used to be at Luke Air Force Base. That's where I went through in the Triple Nickel. It subsequently moved to Seymour Johnson Air Force Base. And it was about 6 months long. You also have water survival. You have SEER, which is survival, evasion, resistance, and escape training that you go through so that you're prepared if you were to ever get in a situation where you're shot down behind enemy lines. Mm-hmm. And so it's very robust training. That's incredible, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. So moving into kind of the actual combat phase, which you have quite a few combat hours. So I'm wondering if you could talk us through, I guess first, what does a typical mission look like from your perspective, kind of start to finish? If there is such a thing as a typical I would say there's definitely not a typical combat mission. So I flew in Operation Northern Watch and Southern Watch, which was very different than Operation Enduring Freedom and Iraqi Freedom. And so in Northern Watch and Southern Watch, we were enforcing the no-fly zones. And so we had established areas where Iraqis were not allowed to fly, and so we were enforcing those no-fly zones. When we got into operations Iraqi Freedom and Enduring Freedom, far more dynamic because we had friendly forces on the ground. And so, every situation was different. And, it was interesting some of the contingencies you would get into. And so one that stands out, we were flying a Southern Watch mission, but we were flying out of an airfield in Kuwait, and the main runway was closed, so we were taking off and landing on the parallel taxiway, which was 75 feet wide, which when you have a Strike Eagle, that's not really wide. And you didn't have precision approaches, so you would fly, make sure it was VFR when you were flying. But we took off, we launched to ship into Iraq, and there's incredible situational awareness that's fed into this airplane. Between your radar, your situational display, you have targeting pod. And once we got into Iraq, my wingman had total electrical failure. So he went from global situational awareness to complete pitch black in their cockpit. And so it was, we always talk about contingencies, super important when you're flying, having, contingency plans, how you're going to handle if something goes wrong. So we had the opportunity to execute one of those contingency plans that night, but able to bring him back on the wing and make sure all standby, instruments were good. He had to hold a flashlight to see them, but standby instruments good. Luckily, we had the back seater to have the redundancy and able to call out some of the information, and brought him back into short final and, dropped him off so he could land. But again, anytime you're in combat, whether you're being shot at or, you have some kind of emergency procedure, we prepare to be ready to respond to whatever that is.
Right. So you mentioned the back seater, and this is a two-seat airplane, which is a little bit different. What's that relationship like between the front seat and the back seat typically in the F-15?
When you have a good crew, it is phenomenal. Like, the backseaters worth their weight in gold in terms of the situational awareness. When you have a crew that is in sync, and we would hard crew when we would go into combat so that you would get the crew dynamics that you want, where you really know what the other person's thinking, because it doesn't matter. There's so much information being fed into the airplane. And so being able to process some of that information, and we have 3 different radios, so I can turn down one of the radios, my backseater can turn, up that radio. We can kind of split some of the duties. We've got the radar, we've got air-to-air, air-to-ground, you've got targeting pods, you've got the, fiddle, you've got the helmet with all the information in that. And so you've got all the situational awareness. And so being able to split that, and even air-to-air, when we would do training, when you're doing air-to-air and you have 2 sets of eyeballs in the cockpit, unbelievably effective when you can have the good crew dynamics there.
Yeah, absolutely. So moving forward, kind of in your timeline here, you go from that role to becoming commander of the 4th Fighter Wing, which as the first woman to command a combat wing is pretty phenomenal. And the 4th obviously has a lot of history to it. But I was just going to ask you, what is that jump like going to that level of command? And can you explain for us, what exactly does a wing commander do?
Sure. Well, I had the opportunity to command at a squadron level first. So I had, commanded the 333rd Fighter Squadron, which is one of our training Strike Eagle squadrons there at Seymour Johnson as well. But as the 4th Fighter Wing commander, you are responsible for taking care of all the people, all the families, all the facilities. It's all about that wing being able to accomplish the mission. And, just an incredible opportunity, huge responsibility, but very rewarding to be able to do that. And the 4th Fighter Wing, like you said, had such an incredible history. And I loved anytime we had new people coming in, I would tell them about that history, because the 4th Fighter Wing dates back further than the United States Air Force. And I would always point this out, because in World War II, we had American volunteers go to the UK and want to fly and help before the US entered the war. And so they set up these 3 squadrons, these RAF, Royal Air Force squadrons, called them the Debden Eagles, was the name of them. And the 7-1, the 121, and the 133 were the 3 squadrons that flew. And then when the U.S. did enter the war, conveniently, they had these 3 squadrons, and so they became the 4th Fighter Group, and then the history went from there. And so, I love to tell new people that came into the wing, because, an expression I heard, I don't know where I heard it, but I really liked it, which was, history makes you smart, but heritage makes you proud. And so having all the airmen of the 4th Fighter Wing understand the heritage and those that came before really makes you proud to be part of that organization. Yeah.
And so moving on a little bit further, you also become commander of the 57th Wing, which is based at Nellis, right? I kind of want to ask you about Nellis specifically, because it's a really interesting base, right? You've got the Fighter Weapons School is there, Red Flag is there, Area 51's next door. So tell us about, what is it like working out at Nellis?
Nellis was just a fantastic place to be. The flying is amazing. The training is incredible. I was stationed there a few different times. So I was there as a student at the weapons school, and then later I taught there for 2 years, and then to come back as the wing commander and just see the breadth of the mission set, and you talked about some of them. We also had Amos, which is kind of like weapons school for the maintenance community, really having the absolute outstanding maintainers. And you learn about warfighter integration. We have the Thunderbirds. It's just an incredible place to be. And it was really the center of warfighting excellence. And it's where we taught not just U.S. crews, but joint crews, coalition crews. And, I remember during the spin up to Operation Iraqi Freedom in 2003, I was out there as a weapons school instructor, and we were doing all kinds of training, spinning up for how we were going to handle some of the challenging mission sets we knew were going to be part of those operations. And so it's really an incredible place, and the flying's like nowhere else.
Yeah, absolutely, I bet. I want to ask you about this, and something you've already mentioned this a few times, about how important history is. And you mentioned the 4th and some other things, because we were talking beforehand as well, and it's something that you bring up a lot, is this how important history is to you. So you seem particularly passionate about the WASP and this kind of continuation of women in aviation and military aviation that you're a big part of. So can you tell us a little bit about the WASP and what they mean to you and how you kind of fit into this larger story?
The WASP were amazing. You know, these women were so ahead of their time. And a lot of people don't even know their story. You know, these were the women Air Force service pilots. So this is World War II. And we don't have enough pilots to fly combat. And so some really smart women pilots approach Army Air Corps leadership and they go, hey, we've got female pilots. Well, why don't you let us do the missions other than combat, and then all the male pilots can go to combat. And so they trained at Avenger Field in Sweetwater, Texas, more than 1,000 women who did every other mission. They did training, they did ferry flights, they did test flights, they did, you know, they towed aerial targets when they were doing training. You know, I love this picture. They call it the pistol packing mamas. This was the first weapons crew of WASP. And, you know, they were just so ahead of their time. These women were incredible, because you think about, this is the 1940s, you know, and the crazy part is when the war ended, that was it. Their Army Air Corps just said, okay, thanks, bye, you know, and that was it. Like, the files were sealed, nothing more came of it, and we didn't have women pilots until late 1970s, you know, so it was really crazy what these women did. And, you know, they're just such an inspiration to so many of us pilots that came up along the way later. This was a picture that at the San Antonio Air Show, I had the opportunity to talk with one of the WASPs. So just Dorothy, she's fantastic. I mean, they just such incredible women, very strong women who are such wonderful role models. And this was a picture from one of the homecomings at Sweetwater, and you kind of have the 3 generations there, which is pretty cool. Yeah, that's amazing. So what was it like when you started flying? You joined the kind of fighter community that had previously been all male. Was that a big adjustment? Was that a difficult transition, or was it pretty smooth? Well, it's funny because I had mentioned that I had had the flights as a cadet, and that was kind of a fluke that really happened, because it was a program between junior and senior year. And, you know, before computers were really big, they hand you a form, they say fill out what airplanes you want to shadow in. So I was like, okay, Strike Eagles weren't really around yet, so I was put F-16, F-15, F-4, F-111, turned it in, feeling like they all sound really cool. And it got handed back to me, and they said, you can't put this. And I said, why not? And they said, well, women can't fly fighters. And I said, well, I'm not asking to be trained. And they're like, you can't put an airplane you can't go to. And I said, with all due respect, I'm not going to change it. I go, look, any airplane will be amazing. If I get to go shadow an actual Air Force pilot, this will be amazing. But the form says, what's your preference? And so the NCOs weren't particularly happy with me, but they took it and turned it in. And then when assignments came out and I got an F-16 base, everyone's like, oh my gosh, how did that happen? I have no idea how that happened, because this was before the law changed or anything. But I showed up at the base and they were like, what are you doing here? And I said, oh no, I put it on my list. And so they're like, all right. And so I had the chance to have the backseat rides. And first 1 or 2, super disorienting, right? Because you got a lot of G-forces, high performance. But by about the 3rd one, I'm figuring it out a lot more and able to figure out what's going on. And I flew with some great instructor pilots who took the time with me after the debrief to go through the tape and explain a lot of the things that were happening. And so that's why I knew, like, this is what I want to do. Now, there was quite a bit of resistance when it actually changed and I started to go into training, because there were a lot of people that didn't want it to change. So there was resistance, but once people realized I was a competent pilot, and that's why I was there, that helped out a lot. Yeah. I know I'm jumping around a little bit, but something you just said reminded me of, I want to dig in a little bit more about the F-15 and its capabilities, because it's a dual role airplane, right? It can do air to air and air to ground, and it can kind of switch back and forth between the two. So I wondered if you could talk us through like being able to do both of those missions kind of at the same time. How do you switch back and forth? How do you train for being able to do both of those at once? And how does that work? Well, and I think that's one of those cases where the dual seat makes us so incredibly capable. Because, for example, at some points we want to do low altitude ingress. Well, if it's night, low altitude, you need your pilot looking out front so you don't hit anything, right? We have terrain following radar, but you need to have the pilot actively engaged with the system. Well, we did many, attacks and training and everything where you would, toss a weapon that was laser guided, and while you were recovering the airplane, the weapon systems officer, the WISO, is guiding in the weapon, or I drop a bomb and the WISO's in the targeting pod guiding it, and I got the radar air-to-air sweeping for any, enemy aircraft that may be up there. So having the two people in the cockpit able to use multiple sensors and employ it makes it just an incredibly capable platform. Yeah. And do you fly, obviously you're not out there with just one airplane, you're flying in some sort of group. How big are those groups and formations, and what is the approach to forming those usually? Sure. So typically you're in a 2-ship or a 4-ship. We always fly with mutual support. And, depending on the nature of the mission is how far apart you may fly. A lot of times we're mile and a half to 2 miles apart. Luckily, we're big airplanes, so you're pretty easy to see. Like I said, we come loaded to bear. We can carry almost everything in the inventory, and we're not hiding from anyone. Like, we're not stealth, but you'll see us coming, but we're coming loaded to bear. And so you'd fly with either a 2-ship, a 4-ship. I've flown in bigger formations, but a lot of times 2-ship and 4-ship are easy to maneuver pretty well. So that's typically what you see. That's cool. So backtracking a little bit, you mentioned how important the WASP were to you as kind of inspirational figures. What would you say the role of mentorship is, both generally speaking for the Air Force, but also kind of to you individually? Did you have mentors that kind of helped you along the way, and did you mentor other people coming up, and how does that play out for you? So initially, no, because it was pretty universal resistance when I first entered the fighter community. But as I built experience and people realized that I was extremely determined, willing to work very, very hard, and a competent pilot, they were more willing to go, okay. One of my squadron commanders, when I said, I want to go to weapons school, he's like, all right, then this is what you need to do, kind of thing. And so as I went on in my career, I had bosses, they were always male, just because there were I never had a female boss, but male bosses who would take interest, because again, when you see someone who works very hard and is a high performer, you take personal interest in, okay, how do we have this person continue? When I got to recruiting, it was so funny because I became passionate about talent acquisition, and so I'd meet lots of young men and young women, and I was so quick to give out my cell phone, and people would ask me, here's my number, like if you have any questions, and a lot of the young ladies who were interested in pilot training would really want to talk to me. And it was funny because after a while I started connecting them amongst themselves, because I'm like, my information is kind of dated, like this person went to pilot training a year ago, like definitely talk to her. And so it became this little network, which was outstanding, where they could always reach out to me, but then I was able to also connect them with people that had gone through the experience more recently. Yeah. And one of the people that you kind of helped along was an actual superhero of sorts. And I want to dig into this a little bit. I don't know if everybody knows about your connection to the Marvel universe of films. So you actually worked with Brie Larson in preparation for the first Captain Marvel film. Can you tell us a little bit about how that came about and what that was like? Sure. So back in 1993, you saw a lot of the footage. I had way too much attention that I did not want. And so when 2018 rolled around and public affairs reached out to me from the Air Force and wanted me to talk to these movie directors, I actually initially said no. I said, no, thank you. I was very nice about it. I said, no, thank you. And they were so confused because they're like, this is Hollywood. Like, you get to talk to directors. And I said, I'm good. I really am, But then I got convinced because they said, okay, look, Hollywood's going to make a movie. We want it to be an accurate portrayal of a female fighter pilot when there aren't many female fighter pilots. And so I said, okay. And they brought the two directors, Anna Bowden and Ryan Fleck, to my office there at Nellis Air Force Base. I was a 57th Wing Commander. And we talked for about an hour, and it was just a fabulous conversation. I mean, they were just very enjoyable. They were very interested. And I thought that was really cool. You know, I didn't have any personal connection with it, but I thought it was cool that they wanted to be accurate in their portrayal. And so we talked and joked, and it was great. And by the end, they're like, oh my gosh, we want to come back. We want to bring the lead actress, you know, Brie Larson. I'm like, okay, at this point, I'm kind of in. Fine, sure. Come on back. So they came back again and brought Brie Larson with them, and we spent a few days. That picture is actually kind of funny because it was not staged. What happened was we were getting ready to go to dinner, but there was a Strike Eagle out there. I said, oh, let's climb up and I'll just show you a few things. And so I had her sit in the cockpit, and I was trying to describe like what it's like when you're flying and when you're looking over your shoulder and the stick, the throttles and whatnot. And then we had finished up and we're getting ready to go to dinner. And as we're starting down, the photographer came over. He's like, stop. The lighting's perfect, you know. And so, so we're like, all right. So we stood there. So it was kind of funny because it was not posed, but it's kind of how it worked out. But it was great. So I really appreciated the fact that she was interested in what it was like. You know, she would ask about some of the things like, how do you carry your helmet bag? How do you get in and out of the cockpit? How do you do this? But also, what was it like? How did the guys treat you? How did you deal with that? And then we decided to make it as realistic as possible to put her in the back seat of a fighter. We actually didn't have Strike Eagles. It would have impacted the schedule, which I refused to do because I was a wing commander, so it was all about student production. So we put her in the back seat of an F-16 and had her fly, as well as Anna Bowden. She flew in one too. So we had two seat F-16s and let them fly and see what it was like firsthand to be in a high-performance fighter airplane. And so, you know, we really tried to assist the team as they were doing their character development for Carol Danvers, who was Captain Marvel.
Right. Now, when you have them in the back seat, is that a situation where you kind of want to push it to the limit and really take them for a ride, or do you try to be careful?
Well, I think they wanted to make it as enjoyable as possible. People do tend to get sick in the airplane the first time they fly. So for the longest time, I didn't answer the question when people are like, well, did Brie Larson get sick? I'm like, oh, you know, I wouldn't answer. And then she was on the Jimmy Kimmel show, and she's like, oh, I threw up all over. So I was like, okay, I don't have to cover anymore.
Oh, that's funny. Okay, so something I ask every time we have an event like this, I have to ask, what's your favorite airplane to fly and why?
That's easy. Now, I have had the chance to fly in almost every airplane that has more than one cockpit or set of controls, which is amazing, just based on some of my jobs as a 57th Wing Commander, as the Chief of Safety. But hands down, mine is the F-15E Strike Eagle. And it's probably, you know, she's taken me to combat and back so many times. That was a cool airplane, or cool picture right there when we were bringing the 333rd Fighter Squadron to Nellis Air Force Base for the SAT, the Surface Tactics phase of the basic course. That's me and one of the student Wizzos as we're going over the Grand Canyon. But she's taken me to combat and back. Such an incredibly capable platform, having the dual role, having the two-seat, having all of the capabilities that are on that airplane. You know, incredibly powerful, a huge amount of responsibility with, you know, all the capabilities you have on that plane. But, you know, it's amazing because after you've flown it for so long, it becomes like part of who you are, you know. And so it's one of those things where you kind of think what you want the airplane to do and it does it. It's really awesome when you've flown the same airplane for a while.
That's very cool. I want to give the room here a chance to ask some questions. And for those of you online as well. So I think we have a QR code that you can scan. Yeah, so there, if you use your phone to scan that, you can submit a question if you're in the room or if you are online watching, and those questions will pop up on our little screen here. But while you're doing that, while you're prepping your questions and think about what you want to ask, I have one last question for you to take us into that, which is, if you could give any advice to someone who's interested in becoming an aviator, or military aviation specifically, what advice would you have for them?
So I would say follow your dreams. You know, don't take no for an answer. Like I definitely did not. And don't give up. Like, life will knock you down. You're going to be told no. Things aren't going to work out. You know, if one door closes, look for another one or look for a window. Like, find some other way to go where you're trying to go. And really believe in yourself. Because there's going to be a lot of times when other people don't believe in you, what you need to believe in yourself and be brave. I always hear the term, be fearless. And I wouldn't say it's fearless so much as courageous or brave, because fear is a natural human emotion. And the question is, can you overcome it to do the things you want to do?
Yeah. Well, thank you. That's very inspiring. Yes. Okay, we got a lot of questions pouring in here, so keep them coming. We'll get through as many as we can here. First is a really good question. I'm going to piggyback on it too. What was your call sign is the question, and I want to add to that, how does a fighter pilot in general get their call sign?
Okay, so my call sign was Tally. We have brevity terms when it comes to flying. So for example, look at that. Wow, on cue, impressive. So there's brevity terms that mean different things. So tally or tally-ho is what you say when you see the enemy aircraft. Visuals when you see a friendly. Call signs are never what the pilot wants. Okay, and there's usually a story. Not a story I can share here, but there's a story. And then there's show. Exactly. But you can't imagine the fact that I was pretty much public enemy number one as I went into my first fighter squadron. So that probably didn't help as well.
Fantastic. These are really good questions. So next up, what is a personal quality that you possess that contributed to your success as a fighter pilot?
I would say grit. The absolute unwillingness to give up. I was told no so many times throughout my career. And, that perseverance, the determination, the unwillingness to give up, because the fact is life will knock you down. Life knocks us all down. But it's being unwilling to stay down. Like every single time you get up, you dust yourself off, and maybe you find a different way, but you get where you're trying to go, and just not giving up. And so I think that's a very important quality.
Yeah. Okay, so this one, so you mentioned earlier that because of the restriction of women in combat, you were going to be the best KC-10 pilot in the Air Force, and then all of a sudden you go into fighter training.
Well, there was a step in between.
Okay, yeah, I guess that's the question is, how do you go from KC-10s to going into fighters, and what is that process like? So maybe you can...
It was a really strange process. And so I had moved to California, March Air Force Base. I was going to be a KC-10 pilot. And then the class behind me graduated, and they got their assignments. And someone called from my previous base, and I really did not want to talk to the person, because he was like, no, you're going to hear this. I'm like, I don't want to hear it. Like, stop talking. I can't, this won't affect me. Like, stop talking. But he wouldn't listen. So he, because in my class, they said, we're not going to have first assignment instructor pilots. So I couldn't go into a trainer because I wanted to stay in a trainer. Like, I love flying the T-38 or even T-37, just not be in a, major weapon system. And they said, no more, ever, ever. Well, the class after mine, I think they realized, okay, if we don't have any first assignment instructor pilots and women don't go out to fighters, we'll never again have women fly T-38s as instructor pilots. And so the class after mine, they had 2 T-38 female-only slots, and only one got taken. So I was a second lieutenant. I didn't know any better. I call up Air Force Personnel Center and find the guy who does pilot training assignments, and I said, hi, I'm Lieutenant Jeannie Flynn. I was class 9304, and he stops me right there. He goes, I know who you are. And I was like, oh, yeah, sorry about that. Like, I kind of messed up that last assignment thing. And so I laid everything out, and he's like, so you want that assignment? I said, absolutely. I'm like, I would do anything just to, like, T-37, T-38, anything. And he said, well, did you move yet? And I said, oh, yeah, I'm here in California. He said, I don't think that'll work. I'm like, well, I'll move on my own dime. They said, you can't do that. And so I was like, anything. But he said no. Well, a week later, I got a phone call saying, hey, do you want to go fly a T-38? I said, absolutely. So I packed everything up, moved to Oklahoma, flew for a couple weeks, started going through pilot instructor training down at Randolph, learning to fly as an instructor pilot in the T-38. I was about halfway through the training when I got called into the 4-Stars office to let me know that the policy was changing, but I wasn't allowed to tell anyone. So that was a very funny conversation when I got back from the 4-Stars office, and they're like, so what do you want? And I'm like, yeah, I don't know. He's just talking, So sounded very silly. But the next week, they then flew us up to the Pentagon for the press conference that you saw at the beginning.
Yeah, that's a great example of that grit that you're talking about, I think. Okay, another good question along those same lines. What was the most challenging decision you ever had to make in the cockpit? In a unclassified environment that we're in.
So I would say the toughest decisions probably in the cockpit is in combat, when you're supporting troops on the ground. And, we would try to do the least force necessary to get the enemy to disengage. And so if we had a convoy on the ground and they were disabled or they had hidden ID or something like that, and enemy forces were moving in, you would try to do everything you could to get them to just back off. I mean, we'd do a show of force. We'd fly really low, really fast, light the burners right over. Often that was enough because they knew what would follow. Sometimes you'd shoot, you'd strafe in front of the position as like warning shots to try to get them to back off. And so you would do everything you could to do the minimum force to get the enemy to disengage. And so those types of decisions were probably the most challenging.
Yeah, wow, that's intense. Next question here is, what advice do you have for young women or folks from other marginalized communities who wonder if they'll be able to follow in your footsteps?
And so one of the things that I think is so important is the fact that with the Air Force, they've recognized the need to not, rule out huge segments of our society, and so if you rule out like 50% of your society when you say, okay, no women, or certain minority groups, you rule them out, you have a much smaller pool. And so if you open it up, one of the things we were always very adamant about is the standards do not get changed. Like, you do not lower the standard. But the fact is the standard might get a little higher because you've got more people competing for those same positions. And so that equality of opportunity to compete, to do your best is so important. And so I think that's one of the things that I really liked about being in the Air Force is that on your merit, you would compete. And so that's, I think, really important.
Yeah, absolutely. So who are your personal role models, aviation or otherwise?
Well, I'd say role models, probably my parents. I mean, they were just, they've both passed. They're in heaven looking down. They're here with us. But just absolutely incredible role models. We grew up, I was the third of four girls, and we didn't have a lot of money at all, but we had a lot of love and support. And, that support was one of the things that was so invaluable to me. When I was feeling so alone and so many people didn't want me flying fighters, but I knew this is something I wanted to do. My mom, who was scared of flying, was always supporting me to chase my dreams, even though she herself would never get in an airplane.
Okay, here's a question that I'm glad someone asked because I secretly wanted to ask this. Could you share your experience for the first time you ever flew faster than the speed of sound?
Well, it's very cool to say you've flown supersonic, but it's kind of, it's one of those things that you light the burners, you're going fast, you're watching the Mach meter, and the Mach goes past 1.0, but the shock wave is in front of your airplane, so you don't get this boom. I mean, if you're on the ground, then you hear the boom, and it's very, significant, but up in the air, you don't really see it. And quite honestly, usually supersonic or higher up, when you really get that speed sensation is when you're close to the ground, when you're flying low level. One thing I will say though, my very first time behind the controls of an airplane was a T-37, and it was when I was a cadet in the field training camp. And it was funny because I totally remember that, because again, I've already gone and told the Air Force that I want to be a pilot and everything, and I've never been behind the controls of an airplane. But luckily, when I went and flew in the T-37 and I got to fly the airplane, I loved it. So I was very happy because I was probably a little bit past the point of no return with that. But it turned out being fantastic.
Yeah. All right. By the way, these are great questions, and there are so many coming in. So yes, please keep them coming. We're going to try to get to as many. I don't know if we'll get to all of them, but keep them coming. Is there still resistance to women in combat positions today? Does any additional work need to still be done?
Well, I think it depends on what roles in combat. One of the things that we were quite honestly very adamant about, the very first group of us that went into fighters, I remember sitting down in the Pentagon with very senior officers. And one of the things we were adamant about is you cannot change the standards. And the quote was, you have to let us fail. Like, we have to make it or fail on our own. We can't be predestined to make it through the program. And so I think as long as you set standards that make sense for the requirements, that I think is very key. Opinions have forever, there have always been resistance to women in combat, but I think in the different roles, one of the things we have to be careful about is making sure that, again, like in aviation, what are the requirements, what are the standards, and not change them. Yeah. And sometimes you have to look at standards because sometimes we've had them forever, and are they based on fact or are they just based on the way we've always done it? So for example, one of the things we ran into when I was in recruiting, and we're really trying to recruit more women and more minorities, this young captain, she came up to me after a briefing, C-17 pilot, and she's like, ma'am, if you want more women pilots, how about you don't make the minimum height, the average height of a woman in the U.S.? And I'm like, is it? I was like, really? I had no idea because I wasn't personally close to that limit. And so we had a limit of 5'4", and apparently it was waiverable in certain circumstances down to 5'2". But we're like, what is this based on? When we went and we started digging, and it was, back in the day, the most restrictive cockpit was 5'4". And we're like, well, why are we still hanging on to that? Like, why don't we look at it cockpit specific and see what the requirements are now? And so we were able to change some of those things. And again, so you don't change it to change it, but what is it based on? And is that still valid?
Yeah, that's a great point. So getting back to Hollywood a little bit, this is a good question. How accurate is the Top Gun movie to real-life combat situations? I'm really curious to see what you would say about this.
Well, I thought Top Gun Maverick was a great, entertaining film. I would say a lot of it's not accurate, but again, it doesn't necessarily need to be. When you see Top Gun 1 and you go, wow, yeah, we're never that close. Like, that's not real. But, it doesn't film well if you're really at the distances that we fly. It just doesn't work well on the big screen because you're like, oh, yeah, there's the airplane out there in the distance. And so they have to make it, visually appealing and, able to keep the audience engaged. So, and hopping in a stolen F-14, I don't know how accurate that is, but, it's not likely, but possible.
Oh, that's great. So this is a really interesting question, too. How did flight simulation training change throughout your career, and how do you think it might change in the future?
That is one place I saw huge changes was in flight simulation. I look back to the very initial simulators we went in the Strike Eagle, and it was pretty funny because we'd be in this cockpit, and the only thing you had was this little green HUD, and then you had your displays down here, and you didn't have much else. But through the years, we got more and more quality and high fidelity to our simulators, where you had high definition surround domes that you were in and able to link together multiple cockpits, different platforms, and able to have these virtual large force exercises. Kind of imagine a red flag in the simulator world, where you had people in different cockpits at different bases around the world. And so just incredible, the fidelity and the ability to do some of this training in the simulator. And in fact, this was one of the things I learned as we were looking at creative ways for pilot training and people going mobility track. I had no idea that in commercial airliners, the first time a pilot lands an airplane is with paying passengers in the back. There's an experienced pilot with that new pilot, but I was like, oh my gosh, well, I guess you don't just go take an airliner out and go do touch and goes and everything. But I was like, wow, very high fidelity simulators allow you to be able to do things like that. So it's really interesting to see where it'll go from here, because with all the connectivity and the high fidelity, incredible capability in the simulation world.
So what everyone is thinking now is, how do we get to be inside one of those simulators? That's fantastic. So you mentioned Red Flag, and we've mentioned that a couple times so far. For those who don't know or aren't familiar with that program, can you tell us a little bit about what Red Flag is and why it's a big deal?
Oh, sure. So Operation Red Flag really came out after the Vietnam War, because in the Vietnam War, when our pilots would go into combat, so often we would lose them in those first 10 sorties, because it's just really intense stress when you're in combat, because you're getting shot at and things are happening and you're having to deal with all kinds of contingencies. And so they decided to create this exercise called Red Flag, and it lasts either 2 or 3 weeks, depending on which variant they're doing. And the idea is to get those 10 sorties in training with very high intensity, so that when you go to combat, we'd have higher success rates. And so it is very realistic training, incredible training that we do at Nellis. And you have simulated bad guys in the air, simulated bad guys on the ground, and you've got targets you're supposed to hit. Sometimes you carry weapons, sometimes you don't. Never air-to-air weapons, but air-to-ground weapons. And it's one of those things where, like, if you're shot, there's a huge screen where you watch the debrief and they walk through what happened. And if you're killed by, enemy aircraft or, surface to air missiles, you turn white and you do not speak. Like, you're not allowed to speak anymore, because dead men don't talk, was what we were always told. But it's just high intensity, because you do not want to be that person that's killed in the Red Flag and then you don't hit your target, or all the people you kill, it doesn't count because you were dead. And so it's real high intensity on the training side, but very realistic to help prepare our warfighters for going into combat.
Yeah. We've got time for one more here. So this is a really good question. What was something about becoming a fighter pilot that was easier than you expected, and something that was harder than you expected?
So I would say the part that was easier is probably the pulling of G's, because when you're in centrifuge, that is no fun. The centrifuge, they like spin you around at a really high speed and you're like going against the G's. But when you're the one pulling the G's and you're doing it for a reason, and, air-to-air, maneuvers and things like that, it wasn't as hard as I expected. And, you learn to get in really good shape so you can strain against the G's. The part that was harder was probably the cultural piece. And so I knew there would be resistance, but it was quite a bit. And it took a while of having to prove myself over and over again. Anytime there were new pilots or new WIZZOs, or, we went to a different TDY. And one of the things that I'll say, quite honestly, really helped was when I went to weapons school, because it's competitive to get through, very hard to complete. And so when I came out as a weapons school graduate, that helped out quite a bit with credibility. I didn't feel like I was constantly having to prove myself.
Yeah. Well, I think your career is good evidence. You have more than proven yourself. And to show that, we really want to end here. I've got a little bit of a surprise for y'all. We're not going to end right this second. We've got a little short video to show you. This is called Origin Story. Can you set this up for us? Tell us a little bit about what we're about to see.
Sure. So I talked about when I helped with the Captain Marvel character development, and that was when I was a 57th Wing Commander. Well, my follow-on assignment was to Air Force Recruiting Service. You couldn't have surprised me any more than that follow-on assignment. I knew very little about recruiting, because, again, I just showed up at the Air Force ROTC office, never met a recruiter, but I loved the mission. And the recruiting team was beyond excited to have the real Captain Marvel, as they called me, coming to recruiting. And so I realized that so much of the American public is not familiar with the military. Like, they knew of us, but they didn't know us. And if you don't know someone in the military, then your reference point is media and movies. And media focuses on bad news stories because it gets clicks. And movies can choose to be accurate or not. And so suddenly I was very happy that I had gotten engaged and that they had really made a strong female pilot as their character. Well, recruiting said, hey, we're very interested in increasing the diversity of our pilot force, more women. You know, a lot of young ladies will be coming to the theaters. We need to make a commercial. And we said, okay. So we brainstormed about how to do it and where to do it. And we went round and round and round on what we came up with. But what we finally did was we ended up with about 90 women pilots and WIZZOs, aviators, on the ramp at Edwards Air Force Base. And we filmed this commercial called Origin Story. And so we showed it in about half the movie theaters right before previews played in Captain Marvel theaters. And so the name of it was Origin Story, and it turned into such a cool experience because it became a professional development and everything else. But the commercial itself won some DoD level awards, and so we're going to show it to you right now.
All right, thank you.
Every superhero has an origin story. We all got our start somewhere. For us, it was the U.S. Air Force.
All right. I just want to say thank you all for being here. Thank you, General, for being here with us so much. And please welcome back our director.
I think this is one of those evenings that we could go on and on and on. What a great story to share and accomplishments. Really, really captivating. Thank you so much. And Mike for hosting us through this great conversation. And thank you to all of you for taking your time and coming here tonight and supporting us and supporting through your membership with the Air and Space Society. Your dedication and support of the museum goes far beyond any donations. You truly are champions of the stories we tell, the stories we host, and your support of this museum is greatly appreciated. This concludes, sadly, I will say, this concludes our evening, and you'll find the exits to the rear I'm supposed to remind you of. But please have a wonderful rest of your evening and a wonderful Thanksgiving, and once more, thank you, General Leavitt.